The lawyer opened the envelope slowly, like he was giving the room a moment to brace itself. I didn't know yet that I would need it. My parents had spent 40 years building what sat inside that folder. Properties in 3 counties. A retirement portfolio that made the bank manager nod with something close to respect. Land that had been in my father's family since before I was born. Together, the estate was worth several $1,000,000, and everyone in that office knew it, which was probably why no one was breathing too loudly. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. He read my brother's name first. Caleb would inherit the house on Birchwood Lane, the lake property, the investment accounts. The shares in the family business my father had spent half his life building from a single hardware store into something that employed 40 people. Caleb's name kept appearing, page after page, like a chorus that wouldn't stop. Then the lawyer looked up. He looked at me. I remember thinking, just for a second, that maybe this was the part where it balanced out, where the math finally made sense. He found the line. I watched his eyes move down the page before his mouth caught up. My daughter, Megan, shall receive $1. Nobody said anything. My aunt's hand went still on her teacup. Caleb didn't look at me. He looked at his shoes, and I would spend a long time afterward wondering whether that was guilt or just relief that the silence wasn't aimed at him. The lawyer cleared his throat, the way people do when they know the next sentence is going to make things worse. This amount is intentional, he read. There is an accompanying statement from Robert. I want to tell you I was thinking about the money. I wasn't. I was thinking about every Sunday dinner where my father had passed the good cuts of meat to Caleb without looking at my plate. I was thinking about 14 years of school recitals he'd missed and never once missed for my brother's baseball games. $1 didn't surprise me the way it should have. What surprised me was that he'd bothered to explain it. Because my father never explained himself. Not to me. Explaining would have meant admitting there was something to explain. I have to go back a long way to make this make sense. Probably further back than feels comfortable. I was the older one, which in most families would have meant something. In ours, it meant I was the test run, the one who absorbed the rules before they got softened for my brother. My father had a phrase he liked. When he repeated so often it lost its edges, the way a stone smooths down in a river. A son carries the family name. He said it at dinner. He said it to relatives. He said it once, almost gently, directly to me, as if he were doing me a kindness by explaining why I would always be standing a half step behind Caleb in every room we ever shared. I noticed the pattern before I had words for it. 6 years old, watching my father lift Caleb onto his shoulders at a parade while I held my mother's hand and waited my turn, a turn that never came. 8 years old, watching him correct Caleb's grip on a fishing rod with infinite, tender patience, the kind of patience he'd never once spent on my homework. I used to think I'd done something wrong. Children do that. They assume the unfairness is a referendum on them rather than a verdict on the role they were born into. The rules were never the same for both of us. Caleb stayed out past midnight at 16 and came home to a lecture that dissolved into laughter within 10 minutes. I came home 20 minutes late from a study group and found my mother waiting at the kitchen table with her arms crossed, already rehearsing the version of the story she'd tell my father. Caleb's grades slid through most of high school and got chalked up to "he'll find his way." Mine slipped once, a single B in chemistry, and I sat through a dinner where my father explained, calmly, that I couldn't afford to be average. He never told me what I couldn't afford to be average at. I think even he didn't fully know. I think it was just easier to feel disappointed in me than to feel disappointed in him. When people outside the family asked why things were the way they were, my parents had an answer ready, smooth as a coin worn from handling. Boys needed more freedom to grow into themselves. Girls needed more structure to grow into responsible women. It always sounded reasonable when they said it out loud, the way certain lies do if you say them with enough conviction. I spent years almost believing it myself. I want to be fair because fairness is something I learned to value precisely because I didn't receive much of it. My parents were not cruel people in the way you see in movies. They didn't scream. They didn't strike us. They simply built a house where love had a denomination, and Caleb's account was always better funded than mine. I used to lie awake some nights doing the arithmetic of it, trying to find the version of myself that would finally balance the ledger. I never found her. There wasn't a version of me that could, because the ledger wasn't about me at all. A son carries the family name, my father said, and the worst part is I think he believed it the way some men believe in a particular brand of truck or a particular church. Not cruelly. Just completely, the way you believe something you've never had reason to question. I decided somewhere around 16 that I would simply outwork the unfairness. If love wasn't going to be given freely, I would earn enough of it that withholding it would start to look absurd even to them. It is, I understand now, a child's logic. You cannot earn your way into being valued by people who have already decided what you're worth before you walk into the room. But I didn't know that yet, and so I studied. I worked. I built a version of myself that I hoped would eventually become undeniable. It worked in the sense that I became genuinely successful. It failed completely in the sense that mattered. I got into a state school on a partial scholarship and worked 2 jobs to cover the rest, because my father had quietly mentioned the year before that Caleb's tuition was a family priority, and mine was something I should be resourceful about. I became a financial analyst, then a manager, then eventually ran a department of 40 people at a firm 2 states away from where I grew up, far enough that I had to choose every single time whether to make the trip home. I always chose to make it. Caleb, meanwhile, started 3 businesses in 8 years. A food truck that lasted 4 months. A consulting venture that consisted mostly of expensive dinners with men who never signed anything. An app that he described every time as basically finished for 2 years straight, until my father quietly paid off the development costs and nobody mentioned it again. Each failure cost my parents money. Each failure was described afterward as Caleb finding his path. When I once gently asked my mother why nobody used that phrase for me, she looked at me like I'd said something in poor taste. "You don't need a path," she said. "You already have direction." I didn't understand at the time that this was meant as a compliment that doubled as a dismissal. I have direction. Caleb has potential. One of those words gets you praised for who you already are. The other gets you funded for who you might someday become. I was the finished product nobody needed to invest in further. When my mother got sick, in my early 30s, I was the one who flew home every other weekend. I sat in waiting rooms memorizing the particular shade of beige hospitals used to make bad news feel administrative. I learned the names of her medications before her doctors did, because I was the one calling the pharmacy, refilling prescriptions, sitting beside her during the long afternoons of chemotherapy when she was too tired to talk and I was too scared to leave. Caleb visited when his schedule allowed, which was less often than mine, despite the fact that his schedule, by any honest measure, allowed for considerably more. I don't say this bitterly. I say it because it's true, and because the truth of it sat next to me on every one of those long drives back to the airport, quiet and patient, waiting for the day it would matter. It mattered far less than I expected. When my father's health began its own slow decline a few years later, the pattern repeated itself with an exactness that almost would have been funny if it hadn't been my life. I handled his finances when his hands started shaking too badly to sign checks. I hired the contractor who fixed the roof before winter, because Caleb had promised to look into it for 3 months and never had. I sat with my father on the nights, his breathing turned shallow and frightening, holding a hand that had rarely held mine. He never said thank you. I used to think that was an oversight, something that would correct itself eventually, the way you assume a crack in a wall will eventually get patched simply because someone notices it's there. It never got patched. I think, somewhere in him, gratitude toward me would have required acknowledging the comparison he didn't want to make. His decline accelerated the year I turned 38. The estate planning began quietly, the way these things do in families that don't talk about anything directly. A lawyer's number appeared in his desk drawer. Documents got mailed and signed in private. I assumed, because I am apparently a person capable of enormous and repeated optimism, that whatever he was building would at least acknowledge the decade I'd spent holding the family together, while my brother held very little at all. The funeral came on a gray Tuesday in March. I won't describe it the way grief deserves to be described, because some things stay mine. I will say that I cried, and that my brother cried louder, and that several relatives commented afterward on how devoted Caleb had clearly been, standing closest to the casket, his voice breaking exactly on cue. Nobody mentioned the 4 years of hospital parking receipts in a folder in my car. The reading happened 11 days later, in an office with too much beige and not enough air. You already know what the lawyer said. You know about the $1. What you don't know is what came after, because the room didn't end when he finished reading the number. It ended when he kept reading. "Daughters marry into another family," the statement continued, in my father's handwriting, which the lawyer read aloud because apparently my father wanted his exact words preserved like scripture. "Their loyalty eventually belongs elsewhere. A son carries the family forward. My son will carry my legacy. This is not punishment. It is simply the natural order of things, and Megan, who has always been clever, will understand that I am not rejecting her. I am simply being honest about where the future of this family lives. I sat very still. I remember focusing on a water stain on the ceiling tile above the lawyer's head, because it gave my eyes somewhere to go that wasn't my brother's face, or my aunt's face, or any face at all that might be watching to see how I'd take it. There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't announce itself with tears. It arrives instead as a strange, total quiet, the way a room goes quiet right after a glass breaks, before anyone moves to clean it up. I sat in that quiet for what felt like a long time. It was probably 11 seconds. My aunt finally spoke gently, the way people do when they're trying to manage a situation rather than acknowledge it. "He loved you both," she said. "He just had old-fashioned ideas." I wanted to ask her whether old-fashioned ideas came with a 30-year statute of limitations, after which a daughter's decade of caregiving might finally count for something. I didn't ask. I had learned a long time ago that asking rarely got me anything except a longer explanation of why the unfairness made sense. Caleb didn't say much that day either. I noticed, though, that he didn't object. He didn't say, "This isn't right, give her half of mine." He looked, if I'm honest, like a man trying very hard not to smile in a room where smiling would have been in poor taste. Later, at the small gathering afterward, I overheard a cousin congratulating him quietly, the way you'd congratulate someone on a promotion. Relatives who had spent 30 years quietly approving of the arrangement now spoke about it openly, almost cheerfully, as though my father's death had finally given them permission to say what they'd always believed. "He did the right thing," someone said. "The name has to go somewhere." I drove home that night without crying. I want you to understand that the absence of tears wasn't strength. It was something closer to numbness, the kind that arrives after a long enough exposure to disappointment, where the nervous system simply declines to perform the expected reaction anymore. I had spent 30 years hoping for a different ending to this particular story, and somewhere on that drive home, I finally let the hope go. It is, strange as this sounds, one of the more peaceful nights I've had in my life. Grief for a thing that's actually over is gentler than grief for a thing you're still waiting on. My brother inherited everything, and within a year, everything started inheriting him back. Caleb had never managed anything larger than a checking account, and now he was responsible for a business with 40 employees. 3 properties requiring maintenance and taxes and decisions he didn't know how to make, and an investment portfolio that demanded the kind of patience and discipline he had never once, in 36 years, demonstrated. He fired the general manager who'd run the hardware store-turned-distribution company for 15 years, replacing him with a friend from one of his failed ventures, a man whose primary qualification appeared to be enthusiasm. He took out a loan against the lake house to fund an expansion that the company didn't need and couldn't support. He stopped returning calls from the accountant our father had used for 2 decades, because, as he put it to a cousin at a barbecue, "The old guy's too conservative, he doesn't understand growth." I heard about all of this secondhand, in fragments, the way you hear about a fire from people who weren't there but feel compelled to describe the smoke anyway. I didn't reach out. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't generosity that kept me quiet. It was the particular exhaustion of having offered help for 30 years to people who'd already decided, in writing, what I was worth. By the second year, the company laid off a third of its employees. By the third, the lake house went up for sale, quietly, then not so quietly, then at a price considerably below what it had been worth when my father died. Caleb's marriage, which had always run on money he didn't actually have, began to show its own cracks. His wife left first. The business followed not long after, sold for a fraction of its value to a competitor who'd been circling for years, waiting for exactly this kind of mismanagement. I learned the worst of it during a phone call from my aunt, the same aunt who had once told me my father loved us both equally in his own way. She called to ask, gently, almost apologetically, whether I might be willing to help. Caleb was behind on the mortgage for the Birchwood house, the one piece of the estate he'd managed to hold on to. There were debts. There was, she said carefully, a lot of pressure on him right now. "I understand," I told her, and I meant it. I understood exactly what kind of pressure builds when you've spent your whole life being told you're the future, and the future arrives, and it turns out you were never actually prepared for it. Nobody had prepared him. They'd simply told him he deserved it, and deserving and preparing are not the same thing, no matter how often people confuse them. A few weeks later, Caleb called me himself. It was the first time he'd called in over a year. His voice sounded different than I remembered, thinner, the confidence worn off it the way paint wears off a railing people have stopped maintaining. He didn't ask how I was. He went straight to the thing he'd called for, the way people do when shame has made small talk impossible. "I need help, Meg," he said. "Just enough to cover the mortgage this month. I'll pay you back." I stood in my kitchen, looking out at the small garden I'd planted the spring after my mother passed. The one I'd built with my own hands in a yard that belonged entirely to me, purchased with money I'd earned, in a life I'd built without anyone's permission or blessing. I thought about 30 years of one set of rules for him and another for me. I thought about hospital waiting rooms and roof repairs, and a $1 bill that I still, to this day, kept folded in a drawer, not out of sentimentality, but because some things deserve to be remembered precisely as they were. "Why won't you help?" he said again when I didn't answer right away, and there was real confusion in his voice, the confusion of someone who has never had to ask himself why help should be owed to him. "We're family." "We are," I said. "But you have to understand something, Caleb. According to Dad, you were the one who was going to carry this family forward. You were the future. I was just someone who'd eventually belong somewhere else." I let that sit for a second, the way his statement had sat in that lawyer's office, unanswered, 11 seconds of silence that had felt much longer. "I think you should ask the future what happened." He didn't say anything. There wasn't a clever response to that, and to his credit, he didn't try to find one. The call ended a few moments later, quietly, the way most important conversations in our family always had. I am not going to pretend the silence afterward felt like triumph. It didn't. It felt like grief, the specific kind reserved for relationships that could have been something else if anyone involved had been willing to try. I grieved my brother that night the way I'd already grieved my father months earlier, for the version of him that never got the chance to exist because nobody ever asked it to. But I also kept living, because that is the only thing any of us can actually do with the years we're given. My own life, the one nobody had funded or believed in, the one I'd built entirely from a $1 inheritance, and 30 years of being told I was, at best, a footnote to someone else's legacy, had become something I was proud of in a way that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong. I had a marriage with a man who never once asked me to be smaller than I was. I had a career that I'd built brick by brick, with no safety net, no bailouts, no quiet checks signed to cover my mistakes. I had a daughter, Lily, who had grown up in a house where love wasn't rationed according to gender, where nobody told her that her future depended on someone else's last name. Several years passed the way years do when you've stopped measuring your life against someone else's expectations. I heard occasionally about Caleb. He'd moved into a small apartment after the Birchwood house finally sold. He worked, last I heard, in sales for a company 2 levels below the kind of position he used to assume was simply owed to him. My aunt mentioned once, almost wistfully, that he seemed quieter these days, more humble. I didn't ask what had humbled him. Some lessons are too expensive to want to discuss in detail. The family land, the one my father had been so determined would stay in male hands, was eventually sold to cover debts that had nothing to do with me. The name he'd been so certain only a son could carry didn't end up carrying anything at all. It simply faded, the way names do when nobody's left who remembers to repeat them. My own name, the one he'd never thought worth a real inheritance, kept building something. Slowly, honestly, without anyone's permission. Last spring, I stood at the edge of a university lawn, watching my daughter cross a stage in a black gown. Her name called out clearly over the speakers, top of her class, the kind of achievement that gets applause from strangers as well as family. My husband squeezed my hand. I watched Lily find us in the crowd, the way she always does, scanning until her eyes land on mine, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for almost 4 decades. I thought quietly the way you think things you'll never say out loud to anyone but yourself. My parents believed only a son could carry a family forward. They were wrong about almost everything that mattered. The name doesn't carry the legacy, the person does. And I watched my daughter lift her diploma into the afternoon light, and I smiled because whatever legacy actually means, I was looking right at it. My father left me $1 because I was a daughter. The funny thing is, I ended up building something worth far more than everything he left behind. And unlike his, mine doesn't come with conditions about who's allowed to carry it forward.